Oh,
Yeah.
okay, thank you. And hello, world. Uh, we're hoping to have a very exciting discussion today about community land trusts, raising public awareness about community land trusts, looking at the economic contributions and the economic ecology in which community land trusts operate and have been making a major impact. Before I introduce my two colleagues, let me say that this discussion is going to be framed to a certain extent, but not totally, to a report that John Smith, Ashley Harding, and myself recently completed, which was commissioned by the Barr Foundation here in Boston. And the title of the report is Community Land Trust as a Tool for Community Wealth Building. We spoke to about 30 stakeholders or so across the country, interviews, field visits. We looked at the literature, and we pulled together a report that, again, we believe raises the level of how we can approach community land trust as a missing link in a lot of community-based grassroots organizing. Uh, my name is James Jennings, a professor emeritus of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University, and I'm going to ask my two colleagues to introduce themselves. John?
Thanks, James, and thanks everyone for participating in the webinar. John Smith, I'm the Executive Director at Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. Minnie?
Good afternoon, Minnie McMahon. I'm the Program Director for the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network here at Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. Okay.
Now, I know that most people on this webinar are familiar with community land trust, probably, but I'm going to ask Minnie to give us a short version of what is a community land trust in case there's some people who still need some that to be cleared up. Minnie, what is a community land trust?
Okay, so a community land trust is a way of organizing people and assets and resources for the best use of a community. So what that looks like, it's a model, it's a nonprofit organization that owns and controls land. And then according to the mission of the organization and the governance structure, will lease that land out for long-term uses to for the neighborhood, for community amenities, from housing, urban farms, rural farms, commercial space, et cetera.
Okay. And before I turn to John, Minnie, you run an organization, a network. Could you say a few words about the organization that you run and the work that you do?
Yeah. Thank you. So yes, the Greater Boston CLT Network is a program or project of DSNI. It's convened here at DSNI. We are about 9 community land trusts in the region. Our work is really to coordinate around building power for our movement, for the community land trust movement, through policy, through trying to shift the ecosystem to make CLTs more sort of feasible and fit into a system that really is not favorable to the propositions that we're offering as CLTs. To policy work, fundraising, a lot of peer sharing. And I'll just share briefly that among our 9 or so community land trusts, we see housing acquisition happening, anti-displacement work. We see new development of housing happening. We see environmental justice work like microgrid infrastructure in our communities, community and cultural planning work, rent to own support for tenants working on tenant asset building. And all of this is undergirded and depends on organizing, community organizing and relationships.
Okay, thank you. And John, could you talk a little bit about an organization that you run, and I'm sure a lot of people here have heard about, DSNI, Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative?
Surely, thank you, James. The SNI Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative was started back in 1984. And basically the genesis of the start was we exist in a neighborhood from Dudley Square up to Upham's Corner. Dudley Square is now called Nubian Square. And that neighborhood was sat on the edge of downtown Boston, was basically a blighted community where there were a lot of fires and dumping, and the folks who lived here, mainly Black and brown people, were really concerned about what was happening. And so they created Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative to help and take back and develop the land here. Through their organizing efforts, primarily an organization and a community development organization. Through their efforts, they were able to gain eminent domain in this community 40 years ago. And once they gained eminent domain from the city, that's when they established DNI, Dudley Neighbors Inc., which is the community land trust that's affiliated with DSNI. So DSNI is the controlling organization in terms of community development, planning, and organizing, and DNI is the land trust. So we are still here 40 years later doing the same kind of work that we're doing and looking, basically as our motto is development without displacement.
And John, DSNI recently acquired some new property, which everyone is excited about. Could you talk about that property and how it's going to fit into the DSNI CLT strategy model?
Sure, appreciate that. Ben, can you put up the graphic? So really happy to announce that we have broken ground on a property in Upham's Corner we call Columbia Crossing. Columbia Crossing, following a community planning process, which was conducted by DSNI DNI. Columbia Crossing is the newest property that will be added to the DNI Land Trust. It transforms an old bank called the Dorchester Savings Bank building into a 6-story, 48-unit mixed-use development. And it's really the vision and design for this building, for Columbia Crossing, is a culmination of community input, which again prioritizes our work around development without displacement and creating permanently affordable housing in the Upham's Corner area. And I will talk about Upham's Corner later on. So the residents and in that area wanted to see housing, they wanted to see commercial space, and that's what we, along with our partners, had in terms of our developers, which was an organization called POA and Dorchester Development. So we're creating residential apartments which will be affordable to households around here. And the building would also be, the front part of the building will be adaptively rehabilitated into a community service facility that has this glow box where artists can lease out. And it's really primarily, there's many arts and arts organizations in this area. It will be leased out to them. We will keep the historic facade of the building and build out some new additions. But we're really excited about this. We've broken ground, again, working with our partners to develop this building that should come online in around December of 2027.
Okay, thank you, John. And again, there's a lot of excitement about the work that DSNI and the network and other CLT supporters are doing in Massachusetts. I think we've turned the corner to a certain extent in Boston and Massachusetts. I remember conversations about community land trust, let's say 20 years ago, when people just poo-pooed away and did not realize the history behind community land trust, especially in the African American community, but also in the international community in a lot of places. And now I think more and more people are beginning to look at this model, this strategy, this way of thinking, this way of organizing as a response to empowering communities that for decades have been disinvested, gentrified, exploited, and CLT is not the only tool, but it's a critical tool in responding to some of that. So let me say begin a brief discussion about the report, which, by the way, many website you can get it from the network's website, but the report was aimed at raising public awareness as number one. But number two, to put community land trust into the context of community wealth building. And I would like John to say a few words about this in terms of the genesis of the report. But here in Boston, we've had a number of debates about how to improve disinvested communities, like a lot of the communities that DSNI has helped out to improve drastically and radically. But what is we don't talk enough about CLTs as an economic engine. CLTs are critically important for sustaining, building, sustaining, protecting, housing, land for truly affordable households. Uh, but CLTs are also an economic engine, as I just stated. And so we grabbed this concept of community wealth, which is also gaining in attention and popularity here and across the world, to try to put CLTs within that kind of context. So John, could you say a little bit about the genesis of the report and your notion of what is community wealth?
Sure, thank you. Um, in Boston some years ago, there was this huge report done by the Federal Reserve Bank that talked about, that's called The Color of Wealth, that talked about the wealth differential between people of color and people who identify as white. And, since that time, there has been, I cannot tell you how many discussions there have been with different social service organizations, academic institutions, policymakers that really started talking about wealth and what did we need to do to increase and close that gap, that wealth differential gap between Black people and immigrants and people who identify as white. That conversation is still ongoing in many ways, and it really sort of landed on a couple things. One was just, we have to sort of train people to get different jobs, and, so it became a workforce argument. And then it just became also a home ownership argument that all we have to do is make sure that we have resources to help people buy more homes. That turns out that that was not the answer, because just having a home does not mean that you're wealthy. And what didn't factor in so much into the equation is the fact that once you have a home, you have to take care of that home. And that people were not able, in the Boston area around this time, you're talking about to get into a home, it cost about $1 million. And so it's extremely expensive to buy a home in this area. In fact, many of our residents that live in the city have moved out to suburbs and have also left the state because of that, because homeownership is very difficult. So the argument around wealth and has been very so subjugated to this argument around personal wealth and what I buy and what I can do and what you know, and I've argued and we have argued that, things like community land trust, sort of you were able to get into a home for, for instance, in the DNI land trust, $250,000, $350,000, which is incredible for this area of Boston. It just does not exist around here except for our community land trust. You were able to build up some equity and resources. And, yes, there's a formula. Yes, there's a way that we look at it, but folks have also spent some time building up equity and are able, if they want to move into a regular home. What their homes are regular, but if they want to just go to the market and get a house, they are able to do that. So the argument for us is that you are able to at least get some access and opportunity to get a place where you start and where you can build and where you can save, and then you're stabilizing community. You're making sure that, instead of, there are people who can take buses and trains to work instead of taking 3 buses and two trains and, all that kind of thing. It shifts the idea of community, stabilizes it. Schools are right here. Work is sort of just around the corner. And they can support the businesses that then emerge in the community, which based on there was a report in our newspaper, the Boston Globe, a couple of years ago, or maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that literally is titled "How Upham's Corner Got It Right." It's the one neighborhood in the city of Boston that got it right, and it talks about how that neighborhood is stable. They give a lot of different factors in it, and that gentrification, it has resisted gentrification. And so one of the reasons why it resisted the gentrification was because of our community land trust. So we think it's a really important thing in terms of helping neighborhoods around the country as they stave off the gentrification and also make sure that the community the community benefits from the development that happens here. The community supports it. The community is able to support the businesses. The community is able to support all the other activities when you think of it as a neighborhood. There are a lot of community gardens, parks, and different things that we as an organization have to keep sure we have to take care of it, and we have to make sure that folks are safe. But it really shows, the indicators really show that we've been able to do that through the work that DSNI has done, and also through making sure that residents are engaged in that process.
So it sounds to me that we're really talking about really an old-fashioned concept as far as neighborhoods are concerned. What makes a vibrant neighborhood? What makes people feel good about where they live, how they relate to their neighbors? I have not heard one person, correct me if I'm wrong about this, my colleagues, but I have not heard one person say that they're against single home ownership. Not at all. It's just that single home ownership strategies will not go far enough in turning our communities around for the better. And John, you may have seen this morning. I wanna repeat a stat that you just shared because I want to make sure that the world hears this. But this morning, the Boston Business Journal reported that the median price for a single family home in Boston and the Boston region is $1 million. Now, when you juxtapose that with the inequalities, the economic inequalities, that means that that home market is not available to thousands and thousands of families who I can tell you now don't have $1 million. And it's $1 million to buy. That also means a lot of resources to keep that home. And so before I turn to Minnie to talk a little bit about community wealth, let me also repeat something that you touched upon, John, and that is that CLTs help to keep wealth in the community, and CLTs help to protect wealth. If owning a home is an important strategy, being able to hold on to that home is also has to be part of that strategy. And if it's not, we're going to see the kind of foreclosure crisis that we saw in this country a few years ago, where people who were single homeowners, especially in Black and brown communities, lost their homes, they lost their wealth because there was not a space to protect them. There were only two places in Boston, and people may know this, there were only two places in Boston where homeowners did not lose their home around the foreclosure crisis. One was DSNI. I don't think there was one foreclosure based on what I heard and the data that I've seen. And then the other place where people did not lose their homes was Inquilinos Boricas en Acción, IBA, in a neighborhood called the South End in Boston, and also cooperatively owned. These were the only two spaces in Boston in terms of Black and brown people who did not have to fear for the loss of their homes. But let me turn to Minnie. How do you define a vibrant neighborhood in terms of community wealth? What are some things that you think it would be important for people to see around their neighborhood?
Yeah, I think that is the question around community. I love that. Yeah, what is our entry point to wealth, this question of wealth.
Right.
And I think that's the question, is our daily life, our quality of life, our experience walking around, existing. Do you exist with dignity and belonging and security, knowing that, oh, I belong here. This is my neighborhood. I'm not worried about being able to pay my rent or pay my mortgage. So I think there's the sort of experience of security. There's experience of familiarity. I'm part of a community. I know you, maybe I don't know you, but I know your neighbor. And I think, you ask most people what they want in a community, open space, schools, clean streets, good transit, the trash pickup happens on time. Those are the basics. And I think the question of the sort of mainstream capitalist idea of wealth is really, like John said, predicated on the individual accumulation, and that version of wealth that we're so familiar with requires non-wealth, right? It requires having and not having when it comes to money and opportunity, and the freedom or non-freedom that comes with that. So, and I like, you said this older notion. I think I see CLTs as sort of a model to support returning to, you know, ways that pre-existed capitalism as we know it. And CLTs specifically, I mean, no one thing can do everything, but CLTs are a model that is a way to produce some security vis-a-vis land. So when you know that this land is actually now, you know, set apart from the market, from this trade and this commodification, and we can start to relate to it differently, and think about and plan for and implement and steward for the long term, the way that this land, benefits communities. So I think the CLT model, we talk a lot about housing, and that's really key. Housing is a right. So many people are not adequately sheltered. But it's housing and all the other opportunities that open up when we when we have control that's in the hands of the people.
Right. And again, CLTs, nothing represents the panacea. We need comprehensive strategies. What we're saying is that CLTs are perhaps a missing link, a critical missing link that we have to pay more attention to around housing, but also local economic development. There a number of scholars and writers are beginning to also look at the impacts of CLTs on public health and also on the well-being. When you say public safety, I know that this is an area with a relatively high number, not compared to the entire city, but other neighborhoods like this, of elderly homeowners. And so public safety is important to everyone, but elderly homeowners is also a sector in our communities where CLTs can play a role in ensuring that they feel a little bit better about their neighborhood coming out into the street. And so, impact on elderly quality of life, public health, these are things that we have to continue to look at. Before I move on, any comments, John, Minnie, that you want to follow up on?
I might just mention, speaking of older adults and older homeowners, like John mentioned, owning a home owning a home can look all kinds of ways. There's a lot more information we need to know about how that's going for a person, right? One thing we're seeing across the city, certainly across in our neighborhood, elder homeowners, senior homeowners who are so-called overhoused, right? Folks maybe have more space than they need. The home might need some health and safety improvements, accessibility fixes, property taxes are going up. So folks who, one might consider, oh, they're fine, they have a home. These are old folks who might need support aging in place. So we've been doing some research around this for several years. What is a role that CLTs can play in stabilizing and making living safe for senior homeowners? So there's a lot to be said on that, but specifically thinking about, okay, what are opportunities and needs that aren't currently sort of on our land trust, to sort of put it crudely. How can we be supporting other folks and bringing more land into community control and housing, and supporting folks in remaining, right, having their right to remain securely.
Exactly. So I'd like to ask both of you in the next moment what you see as challenges facing CLTs, the expansion of CLTs, the strengthening of CLTs. But before I do that, I'd like to state that when we put this paper together in our research and we talked to people across the country and also in Puerto Rico, we came up with 11 components of CLTs as an economic engine. And I'd like to just very briefly cite or mention these components. And I'm going to have to take off my glasses, world, because this writing is very small. So one, home ownership for low-income households. That was one component of CLTs as an economic entity. Homes with financial security, and some of this have already been touched upon by John and Minnie. Social capital and public health. building aggregate wealth, community-based financial literacy, which you just mentioned, Mimi, consumer expenditures and local buying power. We know that in the census tracts, in the two census tracts, with DSNI properties, in the year 2 years ago, let me say, the retail expenditures were like $80 million. Now, that doesn't mean that only CLT residents generated that retail, but because CLT residents are a big component of who lives in the community, they probably spent a lot of money. Uh, Ensuring expanding savings potential. CLTs have been documented that residents have been able to save money. Uh, Support and protection, and this is also very important for local small businesses. Reducing gentrification and displacement. Entrepreneurship based on cultural resources. And then the last one uh, I have here, which is important to note, is ensuring that community voices are part of democratic deliberation regarding the future of their community. We don't see that as far as urban politics and urban policy. We don't see Boston or really any major city, any place that I'm familiar with, saying to residents, you're going to be part of visioning, you're going to be part of debating how to move forward. And so these are things that again are occurring in different ways in different formats across the country in the CLT community. But you can comment on that, John or Minnie, or we could just move to what you see as some challenges.
Yeah, one thing to raise, it's interesting in terms of the challenges. There are many, but one I think is a narrative issue. And we are constantly bombarded by the fact that people think the community land trust really does not build wealth, or it does not help people in terms of economic mobility, which our studies have shown, James, from folks at Tufts and others, that is actually not true. But because, if we say you can't buy a home on a land trust for $300,000 and then sell it for 1 million because the average price of a house in Boston is $1 million, that somehow we're keeping people in poverty, it would be, the access that you gain from those people would not be able to buy a house anyway. If we weren't selling it for $300,000, the people that were able to buy and live in our land trust would not be able to buy it on the open market. And that we would be restricting the availability of housing if we allowed everyone to sell their house for $1 million, because then it wouldn't be a land trust anymore. It would just be the speculative market and everyone can, bid on houses, and I think one thing we have to remember about community land trust, or never forget about community land trust, is that it starts with the building of a community. It's not just the idea that we should just pick up houses and take them off the speculative market. For DSNI, the first thing it started with was the building of a community. And we felt that, if you look back at things that were written 30, 40 years ago, the idea that we could keep things affordable, keep them permanently affordable, have people on these 99-year leases, have them build some equity in terms of where they didn't have to pay that much for houses, and then they could save in terms of how much mortgage they could pay, would be a really important factor in stabilizing the neighborhood, and they can save in other ways. And it's proven to be true. In fact, in the Boston Globe article that talks about Upham's Corner and the development of Upham's Corner, and I know many of the people in this call don't live in Boston, but where our land trust is situated is basically less than a mile or two from this, enveloped in this Upham's Corner neighborhood. And it says that, the studies show that between 2000 and 2015, Upham's Corner poverty rate fell from 35% to 24%. So that's statistically true that because of the work the SNI and others have done, we've reduced the poverty rate in this area. So the idea that people are not creating wealth is not true. Many people have moved on and bought houses on the market, on the commercial market. So I feel like there's a narrative change, and that needs to happen, and that we continue to do. Many can talk about some of the efforts that the CLT network is making in terms of shifting and putting out, a little film and a documentary around the work that the network of CLTs are doing, and what it looks like. And the second thing is that, people still don't understand the financing of these projects. And we all of us struggle to get financing to do the work that we want to do. So I think those are our two big challenges, in and around this work. And Minnie?
You said it. I mean, I guess yeah, on the narrative piece, it's like, I think the community wealth is a concept, like that's sort of the term, that's like the present day term for very old things. Yeah, it's like I think the individual doesn't get lost in the community, right? And it's like it's the community well-being, the individual well-being and community well-being depend on each other. And how do we have to tend to each other as individuals and to our community as a whole. And I think that's like, okay, well, that sounds well and good, but what does that really mean in this society that we live in, where you have things or you don't, you own things or you don't? So I think, yeah, I think even a narrative shift or a mindset shift for many of us, forget folks who are really just opponents,
Right.
but for many of us who do this, believe in, share values, I think we have their skills to sort of relearn around collectivity and like personal agency and group agency and how those things like dance with each other and support each other. So I think there's sort of like some sort of relearning, unlearning, spiritual work, brain rewiring. And then I think another piece that again with the narrative, and that I think a lot of what is happening that I don't know, I'll speak more locally, for us more locally, I think we need to make more visible is the governance. It is that governance work. It is, okay, you could look around and say, well, how many homes are on the land trust? That matters, right? That matters. How much money is in people's banks? That matters. And we don't visibilize, oh, we have regular homeowner meetings where people are getting together, feeling connected, sharing information, learning more about the land trust, learning about a project down the street, getting involved, making decisions. Oh, there's a new development. Let's go to City Hall. And then our community is talking to the next organized community. So the organizing and the governance piece is really huge. And I think, yeah, we have to figure out and invest more in making that more public and visible. So yeah, and I think the sort of, we are in a, I can talk about the policies we support, but for now I'll say the policies that DS&I, that our network has endorsed, are really housing focused, because we have to protect our communities. We have to defend our communities against rampant displacement that's happening. And Boston is losing its Black population dramatically, just over the last few years.
Yes.
So yeah, so we need to be defensive and proactive there, but also not lose sort of publicly and with our own capacity the investments in everything that is not about housing on CLTs.
Right. And the other thing that happens when you have a strategy, a CLT strategy that is dependent on tapping and respecting and incorporating the voices of residents, is that we get new ideas and innovations, because these people are on the front lines. And so they can come up with ideas that sometimes people in the ivory tower or the corporate sector are not even thinking about. And so that is also an important benefit. And I think we have some examples in Boston or something like that. But let me ask you, staying with this importance of changing the narrative. of raising public awareness. And I don't mean, outreach materials, but as both of you stated, how people think about CLTs and work with CLTs. What is the role of philanthropy? How can philanthropy be a partner? And I know that's a bit unfair because philanthropy commissioned this report. And they also played a major role in the founding of DSNI. And so, but big picture, how can philanthropy help in expanding this kind of narrative if there is interest in that sector in doing such?
Thanks, James, for putting us on the spot. Thank you. Thank all of you in the world who are listening, who are involved in philanthropy. We really appreciate your support. It's interesting because I think it philanthropy, I think, has to think about, we have this construct around inclusive prosperity. And so the narrative change is to think about extractive capitalism versus inclusive prosperity. And sometimes with philanthropy, there's this feeling like, I give you funding, I give the organization funding, and in 2, 3, 4 years, I expect to see this change. And in this particular type of work, it does not work that way. First of all, it takes very long to develop housing. That's one thing. And it in this narrative shift that we're all attempting to do with this work in terms of community land trust, we have embedded ideas, in our context about, personal wealth, and that capitalism is so much a part of all of us that sometimes, against our best ideas, we want what we want for ourselves. And so, and when we're not engaged in community, that can look really different. It's as we worked, over these last years, thinking about community wealth, thinking about the things that work really well, and building out civic infrastructure. What we see, like in a community, DSNI over the last 40 years is, there's accumulated neighborhood power. There's a long history here of partnership between the city and DSNI, where we have this really strong foundation, and we have other partners, right? And so that is built, into our DNA, this community-driven process. And the fact that our land is owned by a community entity, and it's created this more equitable power structure and this dynamic between the city and the community, and also the nonprofit developers we work with. They totally understand that, once something is being built, that DSNI through its work in terms of community organizing, in terms of, focusing back on our community, owns that building. We basically own it, and we own the process. And so they're responsive to that, right? And I think, sometimes that's a difficult reach for philanthropy, understanding that, well, the organization and there's these markets, there's an outcome model that sometimes gets lost because community engagement, community organizing is a much more nebulous, a little bit more difficult thing to get. And the other thing to remember, we have to include sort of the broader community, and we have to include the different facets of that. There are lots of artists, there are lots of, just everyday working people who may not be able to come to, continuous community meetings and all that. But we have to reach out and create spaces where people are able to be engaged as much as possible. Those are not easy processes, right? But we want people to be able to see themselves in these things that we're doing. And we hope that by showing, and that takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot, especially on the organizers, the community organizers, to do that. So when they do these charrettes and when we do community meetings and when we go out into the parks and meet people and talk to them about what's going on, that's not something that can always be quantified by in terms of showing people the kind of work that we're doing. It's a long process. This building that we have here in Upham's Corner took us basically almost 8 years to get to this point, for this to happen, and so we also have to do that education with philanthropy as well. thankful for every time that we're supported, the organization is supported, and the idea that we can just support a program versus just the organization and the work that people are doing sometimes also gets convoluted and mixed. So, it's a process, right? And that process, the process itself is the model. Yes, there's always questions about feasibility and, you know, changing dynamics of neighborhood. But, we are committed through our work at DSI and the other organizations that are at Land Trust to long-term stewardship, which means that we have to stay involved. And communities change, right? Different people move in, what was once primarily Black and Brown community is still in that way, but there's a lot more immigrants now. So, there are language differences. There are Cape Verdeans, there's, people from the global South. So it's changing in that way. So, sometimes, and then we have trust issues sometimes in terms of trust of government, in terms of trust of helping them to build trust in their civic organizations and participating in different things. So all of that becomes a part of it. And because we're committed to long-term stewardship, we have to work through all those differences. So it's not easy work, but we have to do it, right? And we continue to be engaged in it. And again, we have to help, folks in philanthropy and folks, like many were saying, in our community understand that. We have a challenge in our city right now. We are going through, I'm sure other people are experiencing it, major budget cuts, right? Just in terms of the city, in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of, youth jobs, all those kinds of things. We are thinking about how do we respond to that on behalf of the residents that are in our land trust, right? So there are many things for us to think about too that present themselves as challenges, so, and it's not like we've come up with a solution to all of it, but we have to stay engaged with those folks and try to work with them to figure that out.
So since I put you on the spot, John, I'm also putting Minnie on the spot. What's your message to philanthropy in terms of moving the narrative forward? What are one thing you'd like to see, and you might just agree with John or add something?
Yeah, I think John covered a lot. Just very practically speaking, since we are, we are reliant presently on philanthropy and public subsidy. There are other ways to approach this work, but just want to state that largely relying on. Anyway, in these conditions, long-term, like multi-year open-ended grants, like John said, we can hire more staff to do the work we're doing, not to add work, right? And do that deep long-term work. So long-term multi-year grants in the context of philanthropy.
So philanthropy moving away from a siloed kind of strategy, understanding that a CLT is multi-layered, it's historical, it deals with housing, but also a number of other spaces, and philanthropy needs to understand and appreciate that and help strengthen that same kind of model. Also, community organizing. We need a lot of the good that has happened in Boston in terms of communities has been a result of community organizing, long-term community organizing. And I think philanthropy could play a stronger role in supporting community organizing. But as you stated, John, don't say, oh, here's a grant for a year. That's not community organizing. Community organizing is partnerships and building together. We only have a few minutes left, so let me ask you, shift from philanthropy to government. What might be, one or two policies that we have now that need to be extended and supported, or new policies? And I'm going to jump ahead of your responses and state one thing that I think we need in Massachusetts is a land bank. We do not have a land bank in Massachusetts that allows people who are very supportive of the narrative to go someplace and get some funding that could be used to buy up vacant properties, to fix up vacant properties, to bring people together for community organizing. Uh, and that's not necessarily a critique or criticism of philanthropy, but we need, policies like that in addition to philanthropy. So what are one or two policies that you like to bring to the attention of the world that they might think about?
Well, the policies that we have endorsed, as I mentioned, are housing focused, and they're kind of in two camps. One is more funds for acquisition and development of permanently affordable housing. It's both sort of logical, sound investment, efficient investment from the public, one-time investment that sort of recycles and stays in the community and is not extracted out. And we're saying permanently affordable housing. So that's narrative work too. So it's more money for capital work. And then it's also the other policies we currently endorse are about rights, more increasing tenants' rights, tenant opportunity to purchase, which can be paired with the CLT to help bring more control to tenants, even if they can't make the purchase themselves. So the rights of tenants through TOPA and rent control. We're trying to bring rent control back in Massachusetts.
And John, you were part of government a few years ago.
Yes,
So what should government do?
Thank you for sharing that. For those who don't know, I worked for the previous mayor in terms of the one that we have now in economic development. And yeah, I mean, I think government's role is to help us, by being able, the city of Boston owns a lot of land. And, city of Boston has access to buildings that aren't being used and different things. So they can supply some resources in that way, and provide subsidies to help us purchase that and help us build permanently affordable housing. It's a budget challenge. I will acknowledge that. And I think that is the hardest part of all of that. But the city, I think, as it partners with nonprofits and other stakeholders, if they make a greater push, it can be accomplished. But many times also we have to remember that, cities think about their tax bases, city thinks about, many regulatory issues that we don't have to think about. So, I think community organization like us and others, as many talked about, have to continue to push for some of these changes, push for some of these legal and policy changes, and work more hand in hand with, the housing development folks at cities to help them have a deeper understanding of the importance of community controlled housing, and how it can actually make a difference.
So, I'm
James,
sorry.
one thing I wanted to do, since we have, I think we have more than one question in the Q&A, and I think getting towards the end here. So, if you all don't mind, I'd like to, just so the folks who have asked questions, I know we can't answer all of them. Please, if we don't, it's not that we're missing you, but just a couple of things I wanted to throw out that people are asking, and we can attempt to answer a couple before we end. And we're ending at 2, but make sure that once we end, there will be a survey for the folks online. Please feel free to fill it out. It's important to get that feedback for the organizers and us, to keep improving these webinars. But one person asked about community land trust, and that community land trusts often start with a strong grassroots mission centered on anti-displacement and community control. As CLTs grow into larger organizations and take on more development funding, how do they stay connected to the original mission? And do we have examples of that? Minnie, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think, and that question came up a couple times. So where my head is going is some sort of partners in Boston who are looking at starting community land trusts, like folks with African diaspora, Haiti, Brazil, um, Latino folks thinking about, okay, we're in community, we're in relationship, and our communities aren't necessarily all geographically in one place. So what does community look like across geography? Or what does culture, identity, and what we're trying to preserve and protect and uplift look like across geography? And then and like through a CLT, like how might CLTs support that sort of vision? And then of course here at DSNI, we're very, our CLT work has been very local and very based in our community. But we also see we're supporting the CLT network, which is doing regional work. And I think that we have to not be afraid of innovation and growth and expansion and try things, and not and yeah, scale, follow opportunity, grow, develop. And to John's earlier points and James, we have to continue to invest in organizing. We have to continue to invest in process. So I don't Sure, at a certain point, they're just trade-offs. We're not going to be nationwide. But I think we can't have these things be the enemies of each other. We need to invest in both. And I think DSNI is an example of that in our own ways. And I think it remains to be seen. Like CLTs are proliferating right now. We see sort of top-down municipally sponsored ones. We see grassroots ones. So anyway, I don't know, John, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up in terms of your answers, that again, community is a constant changing thing, right? Um, and so we have to remember that, like, we have to ground ourselves back, always remember and ground ourselves back in our mission. And again, these conversations that we're having as community land trust cannot just be about development plans and deals and financing, and they have to be grounded in terms of the community that we create. And community doesn't always agree on everything. Community always, there are always lulls, there's always shifts, there's always, but as the organizations that steward these projects, again, going back to what I talked about in terms of philanthropy, we have to make sure that our organizers are forever grounded in themselves. Like, the impetus for starting these was the creation of community. The impetus for starting community land trust in the US was, Black people coming out of the civil rights movement and trying to gain agency and building, the first one in Georgia and all that, for them to be able to stand up and own land and be able to, establish something for themselves. You know, um, they face challenges, later on in terms of financing and building, which we're still all facing now. But I think going back to, cultural preservation, going back to making sure that people had something, that they own, that they could call their own, you know, that's what it was. It was building community for people to have something to go to. Is community organizing and development hard? Extremely. But if we always concentrate on personal interest, it becomes harder. So we have to reground and remind community that this is about how we move forward, given sometimes our competing interests, but the larger interest is to keep, we overuse this word, yes, it sounds cliche, yes, but to keep building this community and understanding that there's a purpose here in terms of us being able to control something that doesn't, if we don't exist, people have nowhere to live. As all these people get pushed out of our cities and others, you know, if we don't have something that grounds and hold us, you know, then we're sort of arguing about nothing, because people won't have anything, right? So, James, I'm going to give you this last one, and then we can kind of start to wrap up. But someone asked about how do we see the idea of mixed income and the segregation of poverty play into community wealth building and development planning?
Oh, so
I'm
so
throwing
now
that
you're
out.
putting me on the spot.
Absolutely.
No,
Many and I agree that we
this
would do that to you.
to me, this is my personal view, but community organizing has to be place-based. It has to respond to the needs and voices of residents. And so a notion, and I'm sorry to, if I'm stepping on any toes, but a notion of mixed income, whatever, could be contradictory to place-based strategies like CLTs. Uh, CLTs are about investing, strengthening communities, regardless of who's in that community. It's not like mixed income is a magic formula, but some people have used mixed income as such. So the strategies have to be place-based and place-based defined by the residents. Uh, the other thing I wanted to add in terms of what you and Minnie stated is we also have to, in terms of keeping the CLT model sort of as a very community-based model and not property management, as one of the uh, participants mentioned, is we have to involve youth to, more than we have up to this point. We have to figure out how to get youth on board in this kind of discussion. And we have to continue, which CLTs do for the most part, emphasize the cultural resources in a community. If you emphasize the cultural resources and the cultural history of a community, that tends to keep the memory for longer periods of time. So those are two things that I think we also have to be aware about. So, other questions? Minnie, might you want to handle a question here?
Do we, do you see anything that we haven't addressed?
Well, I think this one question, in terms of okay, so can we, the way I would frame what I'm about to say, can we have our cake and eat it too? My answer, first of all, is yes. As CLTs grow, as CLTs become more accepted, uh, how do we prevent what's happened to a lot of community-based nonprofits? They get off the ground, a lot of residents are involved, but then these nonprofits become very professionalized. And before you know it, the board doesn't look like the community at all. And we need the big time lawyers and the big time this and the big time that and the big time financiers. And so I think that's a challenge that we can't, we cannot poo-poo away. As we grow, we have to figure out how to keep that democratic deliberation component of what we've been about. Now, someone did ask earlier in one of the questions, are there examples of this? And we do have some examples in our report. So if you get your hands on the report, there are some examples of what CLTs are doing, around the country and in Puerto Rico. Uh,
I,
any,
I I think we have
oh,
now, because I see flashing red lights all over. We have now so come to the end. Any final thoughts, Minnie or James? We have literally a minute. And again, as we close out, remember for the participants, first of all, we want to say thanks to all of you for being here and
yes.
taking time to be with us, and that there'll be an exit survey. So please fill it out to help us improve. And want to thank the folks who are behind the scenes supporting us, Ben and Tamar, and for all the organizers who put this together. We really deeply appreciate, taking the time to have this conversation with us, even though we couldn't see you, but we know you're there. Sorry we couldn't get to every question, but yeah, stay in contact. There are ways to do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you all. Appreciate it.